For more on this, joining us live from Perth, Australia is Alexey Muraviev. He's an Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University. Welcome. So, firstly, on those talks we've just had in Florida between the Americans and Ukraine, Marco Rubio saying that those were productive, but more work needs to be done. How much do you think was achieved there?
Well, I don't think there was a great deal of breakthroughs, simply because we're trying to interpret the situation that is involving two unequal sides. Obviously, the United States is in the driver's seat. They have the capacity to impose their will on Ukraine much more than they can on Russia. They have very limited influence over the Russians, which been admitted by the U.S. senior officials, including Marco Rubio himself. So I think the Americans are trying to effectively bulldoze their condition and get the Ukrainians to submit, simply because the Ukrainians are right now not in the best negotiating position. They have been weakened by the ongoing corruption scandal, the fact that Zelensky effectively sacked his chief of staff, which is his most trusted and closest aide, and the driver behind previous negotiations. The fact that Zelensky's future now looks in turmoil, and there is a speculation that he may choose to resign or decide to leave the office by the end of the year. And the Ukrainians have been weakened by the Russian continuous offensive, so they cannot really throw in significant bargaining cards which would allow them to get their terms. They are the losing side. So I think the Americans understand that. They obviously don't want to see the Ukraine lose or lose completely. So they want Ukraine to save its face. They want Ukraine to retain its sovereignty. But they also understand that the Russians actually have the bargaining capacity here. So they cannot really come to Moscow with a set of conditions that the Russians will dismiss instantaneously. Plus, there is one sticking point which Russia's President Vladimir Putin once again highlighted last week during one of his press conferences: the legitimacy of Ukrainian government in the eyes of the Russians. He effectively made it very clear that he doesn't want to sign any deal with Zelensky simply because he does not recognize his jurisdictional legitimacy. And that may actually be far greater sticking point than any other specific terms and conditions.
Given, as you say, that Ukraine is in a somewhat weakened position in these negotiations, what are your expectations for that meeting between Steve Witkoff and President Putin? As our correspondent was saying, the Ukrainians are quite wary about. Are they right to be wary about that?
Oh, I think they're right to be wary about that, because clearly for Witkoff, as well as probably for Donald Trump, Ukraine is not a priority here. It's more like an obstacle. They want Ukraine to become European affair. They don't want the United States involvement in a war that it's unwinnable. The Americans are worried about the Chinese. They worry about future security architecture in the Pacific. They worry about strategic nuclear arms limitations, which they want to discuss with the Russians early next year. So they're not fixated. Well, the Trump administration, contrary to Biden administration, is not fixated on this war. They wanted European part of NATO to assume responsibility for that if Europe wants to keep the confrontation with Russia going. But for Trump, it's important. It's effectively a situation when he wants to move on. Obviously, he doesn't want to come across with the blame that he lost this war, because he is very mindful of the way how Biden came heavily criticized after U.S. abrupt pullout of Afghanistan back in 2021. So he wants to have a grace pullout of the conflict, declaring that he won peace, the Ukrainians won whatever they could, and the Russians did not lose, because he needs to have a continuous conversation with the Russians on other issues, and that becomes an obstacle or yet another obstacle for Witkoff and his negotiation strategy. And the final point is, which I think Putin also made it quite clear last week, the Russians don't really consider the so-called 28, now 19-point peace plan of Trump as the actual draft of the plan. He said, Putin made it very clear that for them, it's a collection of discussion points, and they're ready to discuss those points using them as the basis. So I think it's important to understand where Putin is coming from, and he's obviously coming from the position of strength, because his alternative message, you don't want to negotiate with me, I'll get it by military means.
Alexey Muraviev, Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University. Appreciate your analysis. Thank you.